Good morning, everyone. I don't know if I'm very conscious about this microphone right in front of me, but they need it for something. uh, uh, but when they asked me to do this, of course, I thought about my English class in 1946, which is a long time ago. And very few of you were around in 1946. But then I remembered back then I was an English major, and you started with classics, as they call them, and Greek literature, uh, Aristophanes, Homer, and all such. And you found out that muses were people like Zeus's daughters who came out of the skies and made people write beautiful plays and tragedies. And so these muses, as they call them, I began to think about what muses really are. And I think about people like Ben Jonson, who wrote things like Leave a kiss within a cup and I'll not ask for wine. And Browning, who wrote things like How Thou Love Me, Lou, Let Me Count the Ways, and stuff like that. And then we come down to people like Miles Davis, who wrote and did musings for Miles back in the 50s. Now, Miles and I were born the same year. Coltrane also. They would be 93 like me if they were still here. Fortunately, I met both of these people. But I discovered what muses really are the things that motivate you, and it doesn't have to be a beautiful woman or a handsome man. It can be an idea. It can be a social condition. And so you have people who wrote and did all sorts of things. And for me, it came from mostly interested in aesthetics, in art. And if I had a muse, I would have to say it was my older sister, B. She was a fantastic musician and one of the greatest singers I've ever heard. I used to tell my children all the time. My daughter, Tyranny, used to say, well, Dad thinks the only people who can sing are Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, and Ann B. But that's true. I sang a cappella, and for many people thought I was going to be a singer, but actually I couldn't sing more than an octave. That was before people just sang in a monotone. So, so I would have been a great singer had I been born about 60 years later. But when I speak of my sister B, I think of someone I have to sit beside a piano stool, listen to, and she sort of made me want to do something interesting with my life. And for a long time, when I was in junior high and high school, I sang in the choirs and stuff like that. But I also was an athlete, believe it or not. When people look at, when I came along, everyone wasn't 6'7", And so there were a lot of small athletes, including me, and I grew up in a situation in a town where just about everyone was an athlete. I was in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and everyone back, all Western Pennsylvania was one big athletic field. But I became interested in art after I came out of college, and I was very interested in Scandinavian design, and I bought furniture. Back in those days, the brochures and all the displays of furniture had sculpture. There wasn't much sculpture. They were just little birds and fish on wire rods. I said, I can do that, you know. So that's what started me into making what I call sculpture. Of course, I got very much interested in Brancusi, African tribal art, and so a lot of times when I grew up, one thing that was very common among American society was that Afro-Americans weren't very creative, and it was done and there wasn't many places or many artists even back then, regardless of how good they were, that could get a platform for their art. But not only that, I have a friend who, a very famous poet now. He went to Westinghouse High School. He said he became a poet because his teacher said that Afro-Americans would never be good poets. And he decided he was going to challenge that idea. But you have to remember, this was in an era long before you had what they called the civil rights movement. Of course, civil rights movement had started back in 1619 after they brought the first Africans to America. It's been ongoing. But these attitudes that you could not was one of the things that spurred me, and is one of the things every time I show, I always try to show that I can. And I sometimes do talks at public schools. People ask me to come and talk, and I try to tell these children that the first thing you need is confidence. You can, and never listen to anyone who tells you that you can't. So I don't know how long I'm going to sit up here and talk about myself. I would have liked to bought Ken Love's film so you could have seen that. That would have been more interesting. But anyhow, I would like mainly for this to be some sort of a discussion, or at least those of you who have some ideas or questions about what I do and why I do it. I'm happy to entertain whatever you have in mind. Are there any questions? Or anyone want to know what I do? Okay, I guess they want me to stay glued to this microphone. So if you speak loudly, I will hear you.
Why wood?
Well, wood, of course, she came from Pennsylvania, and you know, Sylvan means wood, and you're in the woods. And so when I first started out, naturally I was saying these things that came from Denmark and Sweden, they were teak wood on brass rods in Kaufman's department store. That's when stores used to bring in furniture from around the world. and they would display Scandinavian design, and the things were made of teak wood. But I found 2x4s, which was a lot more plentiful and cheap, and people throw them out all the time. And the teak wood things were very thin and small, and of course mine were fat 2x4s. But wood, another thing was, they used to cut down a lot of trees around the city, and you could go to the city forestry division out in East Liberty and pick up logs for nothing, you know. So it was very available, and I didn't need torches and tanks and stuff like welding equipment. But then I also got into stone, because you could also get big blocks of stone from buildings they were tearing down back in those days. And back in those days, they had marble bases, and they had red sandstone in front of my house. There is a red sandstone sculpture, which I did from years ago from stone I got from a building. So these things were readily available. So I guess availability means a lot in any situation. Any other questions?
Yeah. You spoke about the Muse. Did she them call to you, or did you reach for them?
It was family, and of course, I came from a musical family. Had 4 sisters that took piano lessons. Only 2 played, but I had 2 that played. My mother played piano. My father played trumpet. So we had a piano, as was common in many houses at that time. So rather than we had a radio, but rather than what TV and stuff like that now, we would sit and listen to my mother or my sister play piano, or everyone would sing. So, but I enjoyed it most when it was just my sister and I, and she played all the time, every evening. She would practice 3 or 4 hours. It was something. Of course, she was also the church organist, so she was always practicing. So with me, it was just us being pals together and enjoying each other's company. But it was my admiration for her ability and for her talent, that sort of made me realize that I would like to do something myself. And I think that most people have an idea that they can do something, but it isn't encouraged. If it is, because a lot of people don't see any profit in it, and sometimes they think it's a waste of time. But I think in individuals, I think that there's something that sparks you. Now, the same thing happens when I think of what I do in another situation, is that you have influences which are, to me, are muses. And when you see something for the first time I saw a Brancusi, I said, wow, isn't this really striking? First time I saw African tribal art, I was in college. I had never heard of African tribal art. How could someone be in America with over 10 million Afro-Americans and come up not knowing that there were these contributions? So another one of my interests has always been what Afro-Americans have done, and musically, creatively, and so forth. So one of my muses, you might say, is something that very few people know. When you see my piece is called Georgia Gate that the Carnegie owns, and I have 2, 3, 4 versions of this idea. Georgia Gate comes from a graveyard in Sunbury, Georgia, that African Americans did at the turn of the century. And it took a long time, but finally the government has made them national treasures, and they're trying to preserve them. What struck me about these pieces were that they look so much like Brancusi's sculpture. So you have 2 people from different worlds, Brancusi coming from Croatia and Afro-Americans in Georgia doing something in the same spirit, the same feel. Now, how I discovered these things was that I'm a jazz enthusiast, and I think that people should know the only art in the last 100 years in the world has been jazz as a new art form. And also, it is, along with what we call classical music, I regard jazz just as classical as European music. One is interpreting structure, the other is improvising on the structure. So, but coming from the both idea that you have to have mastery over your instrument, and you have, of course, with jazz, you have to think on your feet. You have to be able to play spontaneously. But these are the things that I use in my art, the creations and the contributions of Afro-Americans and people who have been so influenced. You have to remember what we think of modern art without Picasso and those people over 100 years ago discovering African mask in Paris, changed the whole idea of what Western art was about. And of course, it's still going on. So when I create a sculpture, I just finished another piece it's called Salute to Sunbury, and it's based on that idea of Sunbury, Georgia graveyards. Are there any other questions?
Thaddeus, did you ever have any contact with Andy Warhol?
No. No, I came from Newcastle, and when Andy Warhol would be, I'm 93, he'd be 91 now. But when the only thing we had in common, we were both freshmen the same year. I was a 20-year-old freshman at Pitt, and he was an 18-year-old freshman at Carnegie Mellon. So at Carnegie Tech, they called it in those days. No, we never. And then another thing was that I was trying to make the Pitt track team, and I wasn't really following art that much. But what really got me really looking at it, I had a friend named Charles Wilson, who was a fine painter, and he ended up in sociology, but he was still painting. But we used to go to the Carnegie Internationals all the time, and he was really influential in making me see and look and so forth. So, but I know Andy Warhol and I, we were in 2 totally different worlds. And any other questions? Well, a lot of my things are, I guess, 2 or 3 or 4, 5 segments. And I guess the easiest way to say I have a supply of logs, I look at those logs and I decide which ones will go. But the first thing you have to remember, my things are based on the idea of weight and space. And that is, they should look like they're levitating, they should look like they're on precarious balance, and they should have a great deal of what I call vitality. They should have a great deal of rhythm from African tribal arts influence, and but they should have what I hope is some very fine forms, some that contrast, and some that complement each other. Now, of course, when you're carving and you're making things out of 3 or 4 different segments, sometimes I don't draw, I don't make models. Everything is sort of done in my head, which is not the best method, at least not the most accurate. And I remember someone told me they wanted me to make a pair of carve a set of stairs as an art project. And I said, well, do you want them to be very accurate and fitting? She says, yeah. I says, no, you don't want me to do this. Because my things, I finally make them fit. I mean, so during this process, everything doesn't come out like you want it. Sometimes you get a surprise, and things do come out. And so right now I'm working on, you go to bed at night, you're thinking, gee, this thing is not happening at all. Should I scrap it? But I never scrap it, because I think you work through it and then and try another way of doing this. So, and trying to answer your question is that my spontaneity is just working through things that come into my mind, and of course, you know, it's not a fast process, you know, where you're doing installations or you're doing calligraphy or something like this. This is a very slow and laborious process, and it takes me on the average 2 months or so to do a large sculpture, sometimes large. If it's really big, maybe up to 6 months. So it's not something that transpires quickly, but I don't know if there is any spontaneity other than in my mind. Any other question? Oh, well, I'm on my way right now. Well, you know, if you're going to be an artist, or if you have a passion for what you do, you know, it's not that, I guess it's the thing that separates people who really want to do this and people who really don't. And when I go to bed at night, I'm thinking what I'm going to do in the morning. And so I'm always thinking about the next piece and the next piece, and hoping that one thing that drives you, you hope you're going to make something really, really good. You know, I had a friend used to call me and says, oh, you got to come and see this sculpture. It'll knock your socks off. And I used to think to myself, why haven't I done something I thought would knock people's socks off? I never felt that way, but I always felt that I'm going to do something a little better than the last piece, or at least as good. And I think the joy of life, for me, is the joy of creating or trying to make something. And then, too, I love living with art, not just my own, but my own is cheaper to acquire, you know. Uh, but I'm surrounded by art in my house and in my studio. In fact, if you come to my house, you can barely get in because you'll be tripping over all sorts of African tribal friends of mine and so forth. But this feeling that it creates, it's like when you go to a museum or a good art show, it just surrounds you and envelops you and makes you really say, gee, I want to do something. And I think that all of us who make things or sing or whatnot, I think again of my sister B, she could play the piano 6, 7 hours. But she would never, you had to coax her to sing in public, you know. She was never an exhibitionist, although she did have a trio and played, but she was never one to say, I want to be on the stand. But at home, she played, it was just something she loved. And for me, it's something that I love. If anyone, unless someone takes me to lunch, sometimes I have friends come in town and go to lunch. Now, ordinarily, I don't eat lunch. I eat breakfast and I eat dinner because I don't stop while I'm working. And if you eat lunch, you're not going to feel like working. And I'm always amazed how people that have what I think is a light job can eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you know. So I take a banana and I have some peanuts. I have some wine. I have some whiskey. And I have all those things in the studio. And particularly on a cold day, my studio is unheated. So a little sip of bourbon or scotch before you start to work helps a lot. And helps you see things better also.
I have just a comment. I've been to your studio, and I was so inspired. How long have you had your studio over there behind Manchester?
Well, I was there at 2 different times. I used to be in the main building. My son is standing in the back of the room. And when he was in junior high school, I decided I had to save money so he could go to school. So I moved out of the main building and moved into my basement for a while. But then, but in the year 2000, I did the bench for the convention center, and it's 18 foot long, and I couldn't do it in my basement. So I had to go back over to Casey's Industrial Park. So I've been there since 2000. Shows you how time fast, if time goes. That's almost 20 years I've been there.
Time for one more question.
West End Library, Carnegie Library?
I did a show there years ago. Well, I've done many little shows, but I did a show. No, I never worked over there, no.
Can you talk just a little bit about the great body of work that you created for this last Pittsburgh International? What was the genesis of that? How did that come about? And what was the result of that?
Well, the idea goes to the curator, Ingrid Schaffner. She came to me in the in 2016, and she said she would like to do inside outside, Well, most of my things are done for inside. I like the idea of living with art, and I think everyone should have a good-sized sculpture, maybe a couple in their living room. But when she said inside, outside, I immediately thought of doing what I would do outside. So I did the first 7 pieces outside, which was the idea of roundness and flatness, so that if a storm came up, the sculptures wouldn't come through the windows. And so that was the first idea. And then I started thinking of things that would fit in that space. Well, one thing you have to remember when you're doing art, I always tell this to young people when I used to visit universities. It's nice to make little tiny things, but museums, galleries, you can't fill that sort of space. I remember years ago, I toured a show in Toledo with 2 other museum people, and the first thing they said, they had 1,500 pieces to jure, and they said the first thing we'll do, anything small, we don't care how good it is, it's eliminated because it won't hold space. So then that was the second idea, was what would hold space. And you know, when you come into a situation like the lobby of the Carnegie Museum, you have to have something that's going to anchor. So I was, like, if nothing else, I think I was the anchor for the show. Thank you.
Thad, I just have one question before you go, which is, I've been watching you, sitting here thinking, he's a beautiful man, he's brilliant, he's creative. Do you think you're somebody's muse? Yes. If so, who is it?
You know, my children would tell you that I don't know if I'm a muse so much as a driving force. And I've had at least I was married twice, and my wife's had 6 children. And I've been very lucky that they were all held good minds. They were all smart. They took after their mothers. And so I think when you have children, and particularly, you know, people get tired of hearing you saying this, but I grew up, if people think that being an Afro-American male now is precarious, I grew up in an area. In fact, I was just telling someone the other day, you know, when I was a child, and 10, 12 years old, lynchings were something that happened every week. And when I was a kid, my mother and father would get to Courier, and all this stuff would go on. And I can remember when I went into the Navy, all the problems I had, so-called serving my country. Yeah, you know, but I was treated like I had no business being there, and they didn't want me to serve my country. Not that I volunteered, but anyhow. But I think that, of course, I've done a great deal of residencies, art residencies in universities and so forth. But I think I would like to think my main contribution is to encourage my children to follow whatever they wanted to do. I have two that are artists, and my oldest son was a chemist. My oldest daughter, she was a doctor in respiratory therapy, and I have a daughter that's a chief accountant. So they all did something, because I insisted on you not going to school for exercise. And of course, I would be looked upon as an abusive father now, because I learned early in life sending kids to their room. You send me to my room, I had a good time. But see, my mother and father didn't believe in sending you to the room till after. So, but anyhow, discipline, family discipline was different. But I feel very fortunate that my children and I. One time I did a stint over. I went over to Western Penitentiary. Someone asked me if I would go over and talk to the Western Pen, and I went. So I'm coming out in the evening, and I hear all these young kids hollering, "Mr. Mosley, Mr. Mosley." And I didn't recognize him. "How's Kahari? How's Aniri?" I know they're talking about my children. And I thought to myself, gee, I'm so happy that there aren't my children in prison and they're 17 and 18 years old. Now, what kind of life are these young people going to have? So anyhow, I would like to think that some of the influence or some of the muse I had passed on publicly. I think, I'd like to think at least, that my children, happiness and success had a little part in that. Thank you.